You know them, you love them, but you probably won't have seen one. Today's episode is all about the water vole, and by the end of the episode, you'll have heard us talk about the remarkable character of Britain's most endangered mammal and the efforts breaking down barriers that will hopefully see the return of this species in great numbers, leaving you hopefully inspired to spread the word and perhaps join the fight. Welcome, fellow wildlife avengers, to the Conservationists Assemble. My name is Johnny Bloxham, your friendly neighbourhood animal advocate. I am a former zookeeper with a passion for conservation education and the global efforts for threatened species and habitats around the world. I'm inviting you to join me as we take the fight to our planet's biggest villain and my arch nemesis, extinction. Whether you're new to animal advocacy or a veteran in wildlife preservation, this is the podcast for you. Each week, I team up with Earth's wildlife heroes as we discuss the initiatives for our planet's epic species and incredible spaces. This is the Conservationists Assemble. Will you join the fight? Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Conservationists Assemble. I hope you've had an amazing week. If your week has led you to connect with nature or wildlife and you have photos, videos or stories, I would love to share them, and you can connect with the podcast easily via email or on social media. Joining me now is Darren Tansley, Wilder Rivers and Protected Species Manager at Essex Wildlife Trust, as we put the spotlight on the water vole. Darren, thank you for joining me today on the Conservationists Assemble. How are you and how's your week been so far?
Been a busy one, as ever, as we lead into the spring, and we're looking forward to different initiatives coming online and being outside a lot more. We tend to be a bit like dormice. We hibernate in our offices over the winter and then come out blinking into the sunshine in the spring.
And I'm sure you guys are all looking forward to getting out into the field a bit more then, and certainly kind of the reason why we do what we do is connecting to nature, which is, as you've discussed, largely a seasonal thing for you. But we're talking about quite an iconic species today, depending on what generation you're asking, I suppose. So today we're talking about the water vole. Could you just give our listeners an insight into the most crucial things we need to know about water voles?
Yeah, I mean, water voles would have been a very common animal on virtually any watercourse certainly in England, Wales, and up into Scotland. So they would have been nothing special in the sort of 17 or 1800s. You do expected to see them everywhere. They're a rodent, but they're quite a large one, about the size of a guinea pig, really. So quite a handful, literally. I've famously described them when they're swimming looking like a hairbrush with an outboard motor attached, because they sort of bimble across the top of the water. They're sort of very buoyant, so you notice them when they're around and swimming. They're not as secretive sometimes as they ought to be, because they are on the menu for an awful lot of different animals. But yes, a common riverside, stream, ditch species that would have been creating little burrows, nibbling away the vegetation and just getting on with their lives. I suppose the thing that brought them to the attention of the general public would have been the book The Wind in the Willows, where you have a little chap called Ratty, the water rat, who's actually a water vole, in his little boat, trundling around like water voles would do in the wild.
And that's certainly a book that's really kind of stood the test of time, and I suppose then is great for raising awareness now water voles are in the situation they're in as the most endangered mammal in the UK. But do we find that there is some confusion, certainly, maybe not just because he was called Ratty, but just because of their appearance? Do we find that there is some confusion and therefore maybe getting people empowered about connecting with this species can prove quite difficult?
I think it becomes more difficult as a species becomes rarer and less obvious and not seen. So it disappears from the public consciousness. And in particular with water voles, at the start of the 20th century, certainly when Wind in the Willows was published, they were just everywhere, and people would have known them like they would have known hedgehogs or other very sort of common animals around them at the time. But as they've disappeared from the landscape, then obviously generations of people have grown up without this animal actually living anywhere near them, possibly not even hearing about it really. So it's not just the fact that we would maybe mix them up with brown rats if we saw them. It's the fact that some people just simply won't know that this species even exists. And that's problematic because, as we know, what you don't know, you won't protect.
Yeah, certainly a very poignant message. And so, in terms of empowering people to perhaps reconnect or connect for the first time with water voles, I suppose we almost need to, and it's a shame that maybe we need to do things this way, but we need to give people a reason to keep them around, not just because of their benefit to humans, but because they are a species and deserve to call the planet home just as much as we do. But if there was a benefit to us as humans or to the wider ecosystem, what would that be from a water vole standpoint?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And this is one that is always asked when you're talking about any kind of species recovery or species reintroductions. It is, what's the point? Does it actually matter if you bring them back? And one thing that we need to do is really kind of turn that question on its head and think about it the other way around. It only actually matters until it matters.
Mhm.
We don't know what we're doing when we remove a piece of the puzzle in our ecosystem. So we start pulling bits out, we lose certain species, and we think, well, it doesn't matter because that, what were they doing anyway? Um, and you end up with this Swiss cheese of an ecosystem with just a lot of weaknesses in it. And I guess one species that I'd point to, especially here in the eastern region, would be the pine marten. That was hunted to extinction in the 17 and 1800s, was pretty much wiped out by the middle 1800s. Now, it didn't seem that it actually mattered. It was just another predator that was around. It had gone, but what difference is it making? And if you fast forward 100 years to the mid 20th century, you find red squirrels being destroyed by greys. Now, if the pine martens had still been around, they'd have dealt with the grey squirrels, and we would still have red squirrels in the eastern region. So we have to start realizing that we do not have all the answers as to why a species matters in an ecosystem that's very complex and cannot be modeled. Um, Now, if we were just breaking it down to its basics, I mean, water voles are part of the food chain. They're, as I say, they're on the menu for an awful lot of different creatures, ranging from anything like raptors, like marsh harriers, sort of large raptors like that, foxes, weasels, stoats, even predatory fish will take water voles. So they're part of that food web, and they also create a little micro habitat along the bankside by nibbling away vegetation, keeping that down, also creating burrow systems that aerate the banks and creating homes for other creatures. And also intrinsically, as you suggested in your question, um, we lose these species and, we lose part of what we enjoy about being out on the river. And watching a waterfowl swimming around and chewing up reed is a delight. And it's one that our children should have, just as much as, well, I did, probably the last generation of children that grew up with these on the rivers around here.
Yeah, I can safely say I've never seen a water vole on any of the water courses that I've spent time around, and that is a huge shame because I'm sure there's, like I say, a lot of character in the way that they move across the surface of the water. And on that note, you mentioned that kind of maybe they move in a way that's not as inconspicuous as it would
Yeah.
be beneficial to them. But one of the blogs on the Essex Wildlife Trust website says that yeah, waterfowls can be seen, but also heard along the riverbank. So I'm curious to know if they're particularly a vocal species, or is it more they're kind of moving about on the riverbanks that would alert to their presence?
So they do have a rather characteristic way of warning each other when there's danger around. So, a thriving waterfowl colony will have territories set up, possibly even as much as one every 25 meters, and be waterfowls actively feeding and looking for, the shelter. But if a predator comes along, they jump into the water. That's their first defense, is to disappear underwater. And you get this plop sound. And then you might hear two or three other of these sounds along the riverbank, because the waterfowls are all sort of thinking, oh no, something's up. And then you got plop, 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 and all of the waterfowls disappear. And they're basically swimming underwater to an underwater entrance to their burrow system, because that's the way that they protect themselves from predators. No, there's well, until a predator, which I'm sure we'll speak about later on, arrived in the UK, there were no predators that could track them underwater and through that burrow system.
So that's actually quite a sophisticated defense response in terms of adapting to have your entrance below the water surface, therefore minimizing detection.
It's obviously a choice to create safe passage, into the burrow system. They will often have burrows that are visible along the water's edge as well, but that one's it's almost there as a safety route. And we've got some great footage of waterfowl swimming into those underwater burrows on one of the rivers in Essex. So this is a sort of way that they've adapted to protect their population. I mean, as I say, there will be a lot of waterfowls that don't make it quick enough and get nabbed before they get there. But overall, the population thrives with that sort of system.
And on the note of population thriving, because they are rodents, I guess, their lifespan's probably pretty short, but their reproductive biology, if, unnatural threats were omitted, meant that we could perhaps see populations returning in good numbers in a relatively short amount of time, right?
Yeah, definitely. They're one of those sort of groups that breeds fast, lives fast, dies
Yeah.
young. And so a female might have 5 or 6 litters in one season, and there will be 5 or 6 young in each of those. So she could potentially give birth to 30 waterfoals over the course of the summer. But they're usually pretty burnt out by the end of the year, and most waterfoals won't make it to 18 months. In fact, most will die after a year. So you will get this rapid expansion. It's like all the rodents, they come out of winter. A lot of them have died off over winter. So it's just really those fit youngsters that make it through to the spring. So you're probably down to about 30% of the numbers when you come out of winter. And then they breed quickly. And then the first litters actually breed again. So you get two peaks. You get a sort of peak in the sort of April to June, and then you get an even larger peak coming out sort of August, September, where, not only are the adults breeding, but all their offspring are as well. So, yeah, very cyclical life cycle. That's obviously.
Yeah, it's not surprising then that kind of outside of humans, rodents are deemed the kind of most successful taxonomy or family within the mammal taxonomy.
Yeah, they breed quickly, then spread out, and the territories over winter are smaller than the ones that form over the summer, because once you've got lots of young around, the adults aren't going to tolerate them being in the same territory, so they spread out, and you get this sort of kind of bloom of waterfowls across the landscape. So in normal situation with reasonable habitat and even some pretty suboptimal habitat, they'll do fine. They will continue to create these sort of what we call a meta population, which is lots of little populations winking in and out depending on what's happening, but a sort of thriving population spreading out across the landscape.
Now, in terms of their current population, and we know that their trend hasn't been great over the years, but currently, is there kind of an estimate of how many are in Essex, for example, and comparison to maybe what that should have been or what that has been in prior to the introduction of their main threat?
Yeah, I mean, we've wrestled with these issues when we've been looking at a national favourable species conservation status. So this is basically a metric which will allow us to gauge whether water voles are healthy, whether their population, their survival is likely into the future. And actually calculating numbers is almost nonsensical for a species like this. As I've mentioned, at the beginning of the year, then there may only be 30% of the total that you'd get at the end of the year. So when are you counting it? Are you going to
Yeah.
count it on June the 1st, or what are you measuring here? And also simply just counting waterfalls is impossible. So we kind of have some sort of vague assumption that there might be 1 million water voles left in the UK, which sounds like a large number, but it's way down on what it would have been originally. And again, when you're counting that number, so we tend to think now more about the distribution of the species. So
Sure.
where is it? Where can it be found? How much of its territory that should be full of water voles is completely devoid of them? And that has been going down and down. The national database, which was set up in the early 2000s to map the success of conservation work for water voles, actually showed a contraction in range over that first 10 years it was operating. And we've just released another report, and that is still happening, that water voles are disappearing from parts of the countryside. So if we were to bring it to Essex, I would say around about 17% of the county that should be occupied by waterfowls is currently occupied by them.
And so now I think is probably a suitable time to introduce the reason why we're talking about water voles in terms of their threats. So what is the reason why the population has drastically declined?
So, I mean, there are a lot of reasons why a species like this would decline. The obvious one would be habitat loss. So you will have had areas of river that have been built on and they've become unsuitable for water voles for some reason. Even, the infilling of ponds. I mean, we mapped all the ponds in Essex last year that were there in the 1800s, compared them to the current situation, and of the 17,500 ponds that used to be there, 10,500 had gone completely. Another 3,500 were in such a poor condition that they wouldn't support aquatic life. So you're left with, only 20% of the ponds in the county still there. Again, a good habitat for water vole. But this cannot explain the devastating loss of waterfalls over the second half of the 20th century. And this has really come about by the introduction of American mink, which is, as the name suggests, not a predator that would have been in Britain if we hadn't brought it over. And this is a legacy of fur farming. So they were brought over for fur farming in the late 1920s, and by the 1950s had started to escape into the wild and breed. And by 1971, they were present in every county. And this might not have seemed like, again, why does it matter that they're there? Well, we've got a new species in the countryside. Isn't that a good thing? But they are absolutely phenomenally good at hunting water voles. In North America, they hunt muskrat, which is a very similar species. It's a water-dwelling rodent of about the same size as a water vole, and they are the predator that can follow a water vole underwater and into its burrow. They swim as well as an otter does, hold their breath for long periods of time, extremely agile at clambering and climbing, and the females are small enough to get into a water vole burrow system, and they will just use it as a larder over the summer. They'll go right the way through the burrow system, kill all the water voles, store them up as food, and feed them to their young. And so you get population collapse, complete collapse of water voles when mink arrive in a river valley. And that's what has caused this catastrophic and rapid decline in water vole.
So in terms of the conservation actions, unless there's any other points you need to out, you feel that are important to know about the threats to water vole, I think it's a great time to segue into the current conservation actions by the Essex Wildlife Trust, in terms of recovering water vole numbers.
Hmm. Well, I mean, I'll give you a little potted history of the 21st century where we felt that everything would have been going in the right direction for water vole in the UK, and a lot of conservation effort was going in with wildlife trusts and many other organisations to create good habitat for water vole, to control the number of mink that were around. So mink were being removed and actively controlled across a large area of the eastern region at that stage. And also reintroductions were occurring as well when waterfalls would be displaced from large areas, like port building down on the Thames in 2010 for DP World, displaced about 400 waterfalls. Well, those were taken into captivity and used for a reintroduction on one of the Essex rivers, the River Colne. So there was a lot of work going on, and this was not obviously just Essex. This was happening all over the place. But I think Essex, Suffolk, and Norfolk at that stage were the counties that were really trying their best to get on top of mink and keep the numbers down so that they wouldn't impact as much on water vole. And also other parts of the eastern region as well were doing their bit, Cambridgeshire. And so we thought that probably we were winning the battle, but actually what we were kind of doing was holding the line. We were
Sure.
keeping water voles just safe enough so that they didn't die out, but we weren't really bringing them back across their whole range because mink was still very active. And we were doing this for year after year after year, and it became very obvious that the status quo was not working for the conservation of water vole. We couldn't do it in that way. And so 5 years ago, we invited Professor Tony Martin to come and talk to us about the potential to actually remove mink entirely from the region as a pilot to see whether it could be done and how water voles would respond to that. And that is what we have been doing since 2020, really. I mean, obviously, COVID interrupted the work, and mink started to recover their populations actually quite dramatically during that period because nobody was out there keeping an eye on them. But from 2021 onwards, we have been working to remove mink, and they are now not present in Norfolk and Suffolk.
Right.
And we are removing them from Essex. And in fact, this year will be year 2 of that project to make Essex mink free as well. And that will mean a whole region being effectively free of mink. And that's when it's really important for us to measure the response of water vole. What happens to water voles once the mink are gone?
And so I suppose having kind of the predecessing work of two counties in Norfolk and Suffolk is a great model to go off of. And what kind of have we seen with those counties that maybe we're hoping to be replicated in Essex?
Yeah, well, I should say that we have done this at a regional scale. So Norfolk and Suffolk were the core which we wanted to try to remove mink from. So that was our pilot zone. But then we had a buffer zone of Essex, Cambridgeshire, Hertfordshire, all of the neighbouring counties right up through Lincolnshire, working in a similar way to achieve a zone which mink couldn't get back into Norfolk and Suffolk. So it was a protective zone, really. And we are now, all those counties are all working towards the same goal. Now, in Suffolk and Norfolk, on those monitoring rafts that were originally being used to catch and remove mink, they're having to release live water voles because there are so many water voles around that they're the things that are caught most often.
Right.
And we are now working on different ways to avoid waterfowls getting into those
Yeah.
areas. I mean, it's completely harmless to them because they're
Hmm.
live traps. You know, they're not being killed or anything. But it's a lot of work for the people
Yeah.
monitoring them just to keep emptying waterfowl after waterfowl out of their cages. But a lovely problem to have.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
so, anecdotally, it appears that the waterfowl population in those two counties is rapidly bouncing back, and we're having the effect that we want. But the next stage is for that to be monitored and data produced to see what is the actual impact. We do have a national waterfowl monitoring program, and we'll mention more about that towards the end because there are things that people can do to get involved if they want to. But also the national database, which reported back only in the last month or so to say that waterfowl's population is still going down, but that data only goes up to 2022 prior to this project taking place. And what we would like to see in the next report is the recovery of waterfowls happening from the eastern region and spreading outwards across to the west.
Yeah, that's really exciting. So obviously a collaborative effort across, like you said, the kind of the wider body of wildlife trusts across the region. But what other maybe individuals or bodies are also involved in a
Yeah.
project of this scale?
So what I should say is that the Wildlife Trust is just one part of a very large partnership called the Waterlife Recovery Trust. And this was a separate charity that we originally set up in the eastern region to coordinate a regional approach to waterfowl conservation, with specifically to do with removing the mink. So it's the mink eradication was the goal of the Waterlife Recovery Trust. And that was set up by Tony Martin and Simon Baker. Simon Baker had previously been involved with removing coypu from the region, so he'd known how to remove an invasive species, and Tony had been working on brown rats in South Georgia. So both of these people had a very, well informed background on invasive species. So the Waterlife Recovery Trust brought together wildlife trusts, the RSPB, local authorities and councils, individual landowners, um, internal drainage boards in the fens, a whole raft of different organisations all pulling together to achieve the same goal. And because we'd kind of been doing this work for 20 years already in the Eastern region, we had that kind of infrastructure there to enable us to really get running very quickly and just adapt it to a new set of principles and equipment that we could use. And I suppose the biggest change between the early 2000s and now was that we have electronic devices where we can attach to the raft that alert us when an animal has gone into the raft, and we can get straight out there. So we don't actually physically have to check that raft every day to see what's going on. We only have to respond when we get a text to say something's happened, and we need to go out there. And that enabled us to suddenly really expand the effort to monitor across large areas of landscape rather than just single rivers or parts of river. Um, because the trouble is, if you remove mink from one river, they'll just come back from the one next door.
Yeah,
So it
yeah.
has to be done at a landscape scale. And this is landscape scale conservation at, it's extreme, really. We are looking at a third of England being within this project now.
Yeah, that's really cool, and creating such a strong foothold for the rest of the region as and when, that time comes.
Mm. Oh, well, in the rest of the UK, this project is meant to prove a concept that can be rolled
Mm.
out across the whole of the UK. And we have to remember that it's not just about waterfowls. Mink predate kingfishers, wildfowl, all sorts of different species are impacted by this invasive. And there's Mink are fantastic animals, that they are amazing predators, and it's really a shame that they've found themselves in our landscape because they're every bit, as much a victim of this whole process of man moving animals around as the waterfowl are.
Yeah, I love that point. A strong plea to not villainize the
Yeah,
species, as so many species do get villainized, kind of thing. Um,
yes, I hear the phrase, oh, mink are evil bandied around. They're not evil, they're just feeding their young and finding somewhere to live. They're no more evil than a barn owl. So we have to treat them with humanity when even if we have to eradicate them, they must be treated humanely in that process.
yeah, and I suppose to maybe there is a concern. I suppose you might get asked this question a lot, even though they're not native to the UK. Are they doing? They're doing okay in the States?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they're a successful species in the States, and they have predators, that predate on them over there. They don't really have that over here, so they are able to very rapidly spread in Britain without check, really.
Yeah, and so for maybe anyone who's listening who might be concerned that upon the successful eradication of American mink in this country for the benefit of other species, that there isn't a concern for the American vole
Yeah,
suffering as a global population where they
we
are meant to
we
exist.
yeah, exactly. We are not talking about wiping out a species here. We're talking about removing them from an area where of the globe which they would never naturally have been able to colonize.
So then moving on to how everyone can get involved, should people want to start making conscious changes to start the repopulation or to assist the repopulation of water voles, or if they felt empowered to provide support, what are some of the ways that they could do so?
And the main thing is that we need sightings of water voles and mink, so we need to know where these species are. So people should always report them to their local record centre or check out the Wildlife Recovery Trust, and on their database, there's a place where you can report sightings. But also, every year there is a watervole survey of the UK, and it's run by the People's Trust for Endangered Species. I'm sure you'll be able to put links to
Hmm.
these in your description. Um, and that watervole monitoring program, National Watervole Monitoring Program, is set up to do the same survey points year on year to see whether there are changes in the distribution of watervole. And you just sign up on there, and anybody can do that. It's designed for volunteers to be able to do this survey. There's training materials on there, but we would advise people to go out and do a training course on looking for watervole signs with a professional. We would run them at the Wildlife Trusts and other organisations like the People's Trust for Endangered Species as well. And that way you can go out to your local area, your local survey point, and you can check on that each year, somewhere between April and June, and just see whether waterfalls are there or whether they arrive. And that's the exciting thing is in Essex, as I said, a lot of our rivers don't have waterfalls on, but we expect them to return once the mink are gone. And people will be able to see that recolonization happening in almost in real time along their rivers. So that's very important. It's people's eyes and ears. And obviously, if there are landowners around that are listening to this, do you want to be part of the project? Do you want to help us? Do you want to host a raft that can be checked for mink and water voles? Um, these are the sort of practical things that are very easy to get involved with now. You don't have to be an expert in any of these species to actually help with the project.
That is really exciting, and I can imagine there is a huge sense of excitement. That year when you don't know if it's going to happen. Same as when you're just generally wildlife spotting in at any point. You don't know whether it's going to appear because there is that uncertainty.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can imagine that the thrill of that potential to see them is
The,
quite exciting.
I think that nice thing was when we've done the reintroduction and somebody's gone along the river and they contact us with a photograph, and it might be quite a blurry one, just saying, "I've just seen my first waterfowl," and
Yeah.
people are thrilled because they just weren't expecting it. So, to have these animals back in the wild and being seen so regularly in the areas where they're safe now is just phenomenal. And even down to walking along a river with mink on, it's very quiet. There's not really much going on. But once the mink have gone, and I remember walking along the River Stort, which is on the Hertfordshire-Essex border, and every 20 meters there was a moorhen sitting on a nest. Well, that just would not have happened 10 years previously. So yeah, it is a thrill, I think, to be in the presence of any wildlife, but particularly some that you're not expecting to see.
Yeah, I've never seen a kingfisher, and it's one never,
Oh,
and it's one that I'm so
you are going
desperate
to
to
have to
see.
come out on the rivers with me.
I would love that. I would absolutely love that. And if you could show me all of the places to best see a kingfisher, it would make my day.
I'll tell you, with kingfishers, you will hear them first. You hear this
Yeah.
whistling sound, and then they come just bolting down the river, and it's like a sort of azure colored arrow flying across the water. It's incredible.
Yeah, and it's yeah, just a bird that I really enjoy seeing, and I think I could probably watch them to no end.
Yeah.
So you actually mentioned a group of people that I wasn't, I was kind of aware of, but I wasn't really expecting to be brought up in landowners in terms of if they want to collaborate by letting you host a raft there. But is there any way that landowners can kind of maybe better manage the rivers on their land that would support water voles in terms
Yeah,
of
certainly. And also, there is a good little guidance booklet for landowners on how to manage your ditches and streams for watervole, which gives some sort of very simple guidance. And a lot of it is to do with allowing that fringe of vegetation to grow along the edge of streams, ditches, and rivers, and not mowing it right down flat every year to make it look tidy, because waterfoles need that cover from predators, so they need to be under cover and they need the food as well, especially coming out of spring. And this is often the time when people will take a flail to the bank, the river bank, and tidy it up, and leaving no real vegetation or cover for water voles. So that's a very simple thing to do. And especially on areas where there are livestock, it's limiting their access to the water because, cattle in particular will heavily poach the banks. That's when they sort of push their feet into the mud, and they basically break the banks down. And waterfoles, being burrowing animals, cannot burrow into a bank which has been completely smashed to bits by cattle. So it's trying to, sort of fence off sections where the waterfoles can be, and then allowing access, just in certain areas for livestock, or even we've provided solar pumps on some rivers to pump water up to drinking troughs and things for livestock. But mostly, yes, it's about allowing those bank sides to be a bit untidy. It's
Mhm.
that 2 meter fringe from the water's edge up the bank top. That's what's most important. Waterfalls don't go a long distance away from the river edge. So if you've left that, then you're probably going to have, good cover for them.
I think yeah, it's a real great point to kind of round out the story of where we're at currently and what the near future is going to hold with regard to the actions for water voles. So now we're just going to switch track and have a look into how you got to where you are today, Darren. Is there a kind of an insight into your professional background or a journey that you just would like to relay as to how you got involved with the Essex Wildlife Trust?
Yeah, I guess I've taken a rather atypical route to get here because in my 20s and 30s I was actually a touring musician, so I wasn't anything to do with conservation organisations. but I was always volunteering for things and getting involved with, Greenpeace and the Wildlife Trust, or doing volunteering stuff in between tours. And then it just occurred to me that really I've been banging on about wildlife for such a long time, I should really learn something about it. So I visited a friend who was actually a manager at Essex Wildlife Trust. I went to their headquarters, which at that time was in a different location to where it is now. And I spoke to Graham, and he said, "Look, I'm sorry, Dan, but it doesn't matter how enthusiastic you are. I think you're probably going to have to go and do some kind of qualification." So I signed up literally that day. I signed up for a degree at Otley College, as it was in Suffolk, and did a conservation management degree over the next 3 years, and then just started volunteering for everything that I could. And I got a little bit of work from the Mammal Society for doing some waterfowl surveys. And because I'd volunteered at college to do some radio tracking, suddenly I realized that I was probably one of the few people in the county that had that skill, and was then, sort of going off and doing things like that. But it was basically a lot of volunteering, and then low paid bits and pieces of survey work, and gradually making myself known amongst the people in the sort of wildlife trusts in the region. And then, of course, when the water for wildlife job came up with the Wildlife Trust, I put in for it. And I'd already, by that stage, surveyed every river in Essex. So I was probably better informed about the rivers than anybody that was on the interview panel by that stage. So it can be it can take a long time. It took me 9 years from that original conversation with my friend at Essex Wildlife Trust to the point where I got a job there. But all that time was worthwhile. I was always looking for different things that I could do and volunteer for. And I would thoroughly recommend that to anybody, whether you're still at college or even thinking about going to college to do a degree, is contact your local Wildlife Trust, RSPB, whatever organisation you like, Woodland Trust, and start to get a little bit of experience of how do you go out and survey. What do you have to look for? Can somebody help you out? Can a local natural history group help you out? They're often populated with incredibly expert people that are not professionally involved with any organisation, but they've got the knowledge. They really have. And I learned a lot from the Colchester Natural History Society in those early days, and I still do, in fact.
Yeah, it's truly amazing, and you're, I suppose, also then a huge ambassador for those who are having a career change as well.
I think that one of the best things to do is follow your passion, and if that can take you into a job, then all the better for it. But if you're doing something you love, you will never grow bored of it. And again, I'd say that it's one of the easiest things to do with conservation. I mean, in a way, it's a two-edged sword, because we maybe don't earn as much as professionals in other organizations. That's for sure. We do this for the love of it, and a lot of our time and effort getting the skills that we want is done unpaid, and that's the downside of it. But the upside of it is that you can get that training in your spare time for free, largely, and you will benefit from it when you come to sort of look for a job. And I think the other thing that is absolutely important is that citizen science. I'm a huge advocate for citizen science. People that they've got their own job, but they want to help the environment as well. They come along to us and sign up as a river champion or something, and they do work that is really important for us to do, that we just don't have the staff time to be able to do. So, a recent one was eDNA surveys. So basically taking water samples, stripping out the DNA, and then being able to tell exactly what suite of species have been along that river. We were able to do a mammal survey of a whole river in a day with our volunteers doing this very thing. I can't imagine how many weeks it would take me to walk a river and survey it by hand, and I wouldn't get half the species that come up in those surveys. So citizen science is just a phenomenal thing and something that we can all get involved with.
Yeah, that's really cool. I wouldn't have even known that that's a thing that you'd be able to do. So that's so clever. And I suppose when the results first pop up in front of you, just
It,
reading, glancing over that
yeah,
is again full of excitement.
it's quite frightening, really, because you realise your own inadequacies.
And so you mentioned kind of because it's a job of passion and it's something that you love that you can never grow bored of. Is there a favorite part of your role?
Well, I came up through the survey route, as I said, surveying the rivers, and I'm never happier than when I'm just looking for the signs of animals and recognizing them. That first time you go out on your own is terrifying because you think,
Mhm.
oh, I really don't know what I'm doing. And then you see something and you think, that's that. That's an otter strain. That's an otter dropping. I now know that an otter has been here. And that again is one of those delights of being able to read the landscape, look at the way that animals are moving through a landscape and recognizing it for what it is. It opens your eyes to a whole new world. So yeah, I'm always happy doing that. There seem to be kind of two main routes into the conservation world, and that's the what I would describe the ranger route and the survey routes. The rangers are out there and they're hoying around bits of wood and making boardwalks and creating fences and managing their reserves, and they know every inch of their reserve and what's where. And then there are those of us bumbling across the countryside looking to try to work out what's there. And I've come through that route.
I think that's a really lovely and probably quite a comforting journey for maybe others listening who have maybe been thinking about transitioning into a conservation or role. Because
Mm,
something I heard a lot as a zookeeper with a lot of our volunteers was, oh, I'd love to do what you've done. If only I'd done that when I was at college
yeah.
studying. But actually, it's not too late just
Uh,
because you've been doing 15, 20 years in IT or something like that.
Yeah, I totally agree because I was 35 when I got my degree. It wasn't something that I thought of doing when I was 18. So it's not too late to swap. We've got people working for us that worked in the city on the stock exchange and decided, I want to do something better. Now, it's taken quite a pay cut,
Yeah.
but actually really thriving doing the conservation work. So I think it's always there for people that have got that passion and the ability to be able to do it. And we're always trying now to really get away from just this idea that you have to have the degree to be able to do it. I think that was the case 20 years ago. Certainly when I was trying to get a job, I wouldn't have been able to get one without the degree. But now it's so important that people have that passion and that they they can show that they've been doing the things that we want out of them to be able to do that job. And the degrees, yeah, it would be great if you had some sort of qualification, but it's not the be all and end all. I look for people with that glint in their eye, I think.
Yeah, definitely something that can't be taught is passion. So to close out the episode, Darren, we're just gonna have some quick fire questions to learn a bit more about what makes you tick. So are there any dream species that you would love to see in the wild in the UK?
This is going to seem ridiculous, but I'd love to see an otter.
Yeah.
Now, I have done thousands of otter surveys. I've never seen an otter swimming around. I picked up probably more otters dead on the road than anybody cares to imagine. So I've seen otters, but I would just like that time on a riverbank with an otter swimming around.
Hopefully one day. There's certainly lots of hard work going into to creating a safe haven for Eurasian
Yeah.
otters back in this country. So hopefully one day that dream will become a reality for you. Now, we're certainly advocating here on the podcast that Britain has lots of beautiful wild places and wild spaces. Are there any particular parts of even just the county of Essex that you really enjoy, or the wider spread of the UK, are the places that you really enjoy visiting?
I mean, there are a lot. I have family in Wales as well, so Snowdonia is an area that we used to go to an awful lot, and it's just totally different. But I think one of the best experiences I had was volunteering as a wildlife trust officer, but volunteering over in the Gower in Wales on Skomer Island, and that's just such a different habitat to the salt marshes, which I love along the Essex coast. Salt marsh is amazing, but seeing ravens, puffins, they're just an amazing environment. And you're so isolated because once the boats with the tourists stop coming, you're on there on your own with probably a handful of other people. Fantastic isolation.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. Really idyllic sometimes, I suppose. And like you've explained that part of being out in the wilds, walking along the rivers, surveying, is sound or of nature. So do you have a particular sound made by an animal that you really enjoy hearing while you're out and about?
That maybe this is going at it a slightly different way, but there's nothing like hearing a dormouse snoring. It's just the most bizarre thing ever. Because we do a lot of dormouse surveys in Essex and so we're right on the edge of their range really here in the eastern region. So that's great. But I suppose if I was out and about, I mean, obviously I'm always listening for bird song, and I don't class myself as a particularly brilliant birder, but I do know a fair number. Um, and the other day I was at a farm that farms in a very environmentally friendly way, and there was a flock of linnets there making a heck of a racket. But the sound of their wings when they took off, there must have been 400 linnets. They all took off at once, and it was just this whoosh of air being pushed down by these hundreds of beating wings was it sent a shiver up my spine because we do not see flocks of birds like that these days in
Mm.
arable farms. And it just goes to show that if you've got a really forward-thinking landowner that farms in an environmentally friendly way, these flocks could be there. They should be there across our environment, and they're just not.
Yeah, that's really cool. I can kind of relate in a sense. So when I worked in Yorkshire for a little bit, at the wildlife park up there, and it was very much formerly agricultural land. Um, and we used to get murmurations of starlings disappearing into the long grass, and yeah, hearing all of those wings in unison. If anyone has ever seen a murmuration, or hasn't, rather, I'd urge you to YouTube it. And even that wouldn't have a comparison to what it's like to experience it in person. But yeah, yeah, I get what you're saying.
Yeah, especially if you're actually under it as it's happening. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, no.
definitely. So after a day fighting extinction, how do you relax? How do you unwind?
I basically get my guitar out.
Yeah.
Yeah, just music still is still a big thing in my life. I still play with other people. I have my own little recording studio at home, which I use for when people want me to help out on albums and things like that. So I've still got that foot in the music world as well. And I feel absolutely, blessed in many ways to have been able to do both these careers that are both big passions of mine. So yeah, music takes you out of yourself. You don't have to be playing in front of an audience.
Mhm.
You can just dissolve away a very bad day just by playing the piano or picking up the guitar, and that's my sort of refuge really from a working day.
Fantastic. So, last question then. How can our listeners follow the work of Essex Wildlife Trust specifically for waterfowls, but also just in their wider missions?
Yeah, I mean, we have a number of different social media channels under Essex Wildlife Trust that you can follow the day-to-day stuff, and you'll see a lot of photographs of what's happening, and you'll also hear about all the different campaigns we're doing. We've got Spring Pickers that happens every spring, which is collecting 5 pieces of rubbish a day for 10 days. And that one may seem very unglamorous, but it certainly opens your eyes to the amount of litter out there. But we collect huge quantities during that sort of campaign. But yeah, keep your eye open on socials. The website's also where you could sign up if you want to become a citizen scientist or a volunteer of any sort. We have all sorts of different opportunities for people, and we're refining that even further as we go along. With things like the Dormouse surveys as well, which take place every year. So yeah, it's just keeping your eye out on the web really, or pop down to your local nature discovery centre and talk to the staff there, because everybody will be happy to welcome you in.
Fantastic. We'll be sure to provide links to those in the show notes as well. So with that last question, Darren, thank you so much for teaming up with me on this episode of the Conservationists Assemble. It's been an absolute pleasure to listen to your anecdotes and your stories on water voles and their conservation and what seems like a very proactive and positive future for them. So yeah, we look forward to seeing and keeping up to date with future updates and wish you all the best going forward.
It's been a pleasure to speak to you, Johnny. Thanks ever so much, and for all that you're doing with the podcast as well, because it's really important that these messages get out. So well done on all your work on this.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you so much. Well, I don't know about you, but I feel very inspired to step outside my front door and embrace Britain's wild spaces. And I very much look forward to connecting again with Darren in the future to go and see the environment that he and the amazing team at the Wildlife Trust are working to preserve and the species they are hoping to bring back. And hopefully you will see some waterfowls and kingfishers amongst so much more during that time. Of course, a huge shout out to you, my fellow wildlife avengers, for tuning in. Please follow, subscribe and rate the podcast wherever you stream from. Connect with the podcast on social media or via email to stay up to date with the latest developments, and share with your family and friends to help stack the odds in conservation's favour. Be sure to tune in to next week's fantastic episode. You have been listening to the Conservationists Assemble. I am your host, Johnny Bloxham, and I'll see you all next time.